Hello, hello. Welcome to Rachel Paints Poorly. My name is Rachel and I paint poorly. Today, I'm going to be painting Bright Unity, originally painted in 1925 by Wassily Kandinsky. So, who is Wassily Kandinsky? Wassily Kandinsky was born on December 16, 1866 in Moscow to Vassily Silverstrovich Kandinsky and Lidia Ticheeva. His parents were cultured and well-to-do, with his father being the head of a tea importing company. They enjoyed traveling. In 1869, the family journeyed to northern Italy, including Venice. In 1871, the Kandinskys moved to Odessa, Russia, now Ukraine, on the Black Sea coast. His parents divorced soon after. Vassyly's education was looked after by his mother's sister, the highly educated Elizabeth Ticheeva, to whom he would later dedicate his 1912 book on the spiritual in art, and painting in particular. Elizabeth must have done a good job. In 1886, Vassily attended the law faculty of Moscow University, graduating with honors. He became an academic assistant in economics and statistics in 1893 and began writing his dissertation on the iron law of wages and the legality of laborers' wages. By the end of 1895, however, he dropped out of completing his dissertation, instead beginning work as an artistic director at a printing company. The following year, he received an offer to teach at the University of Dorpat, Russia, now Tartu, Estonia, but he turned it down. He had seen one of Monet's Haystack paintings at a traveling art exhibition in Moscow. The non-objective effect of the work left a strong impression on him, and at the age of 30, he moved with his wife Anya to Munich to study painting. Attending Anton Azbe's private art school from 1897 to 1898, Vassyly's first participation in Odessa's Association of South Russian Artists annual exhibition occurred in 1898, though we don't know what those works looked like. In 1899, Vassily, ever the intellectual, published his first two articles about art, on the Munich Secession and on photography, respectively. In 1901, Vassily increasingly began painting on his own, independent of any academic instruction. His small oil works were created directly from nature and featured views of Munich and the hinterland, as well as fairy tales often drawn in Russian historical settings. He said, quote, "It soon appeared to me that past ages, having no longer any real existence, could provide me with pretexts for that use of color which I felt within myself." End quote. His first one-man show took place in Moscow in 1903. From 1903 to 1908, he traveled throughout Europe and into northern Africa, visiting Holland, Tunisia, Italy, France, and back to Russia, before finally setting in the town of Murnau in southern Bavaria. Here his style began to emerge, leading to what would become complete abstraction. In the final passage of On the Spiritual in Art, he described his process of dividing his work into three categories. Quote, "First, the direct impression of external nature, expressed in linear, painterly form. I call these pictures impressions. Second, chiefly unconscious, impressions of internal nature. I call this type improvations. Third, the expressions of feelings that have been forming within me in a similar way, but over a very long period of time, which, after the first preliminary sketches, I have slowly and almost pedantically examined and worked out. This kind of picture I call a composition. Here reason, the conscious, the deliberate, and the purposeful play a preponderant role, except that I always decide in favor of feeling rather than calculation." In 1910, he completed what is referred to as abstract watercolor, which is commonly regarded as a study for 1913's Composition 7. His embrace of abstract art created conflict with more conservative members of his artistic circle, and so in 1911, Vassily and Munich painter Franz Marc founded Der Blaureiter, an art almanac intended as a forum for artists to present works from different genres and periods. In 1910, Der Blaureiter published Vassyly's essays on the questions of form and on stage composition. After the outbreak of World War I, Vassily, a Russian citizen, left Germany and returned to Russia. After the Russian Revolution, he was involved in a variety of committees for art education and museums, including the 1919 appointment as first director of the Museum of Painterly Culture in Moscow. Not belonging to the Communist Party, plus artistic and philosophical detachment, as well as hardships due to the Revolution and Civil War, contributed to Vassyly's desire to leave Russia. In December of 1921, Wassily and his second wife, Nina, left Russia for the Bauhaus in Weimar, Germany. A school that combined crafts with the fine arts, the Bauhaus became famous for its method of design, in which methods of mass production were combined with artistic vision and style, bringing together aesthetic form and everyday function. Wassily began teaching at the Bauhaus in June 1922, as both a master in the wall painting workshop and teaching the theory of form in the preliminary course. To promote his work in the United States, in 1924, Der Blaue Vier, or the Blue Four, group was created, with Lionel Feininger, Alexei Jawlensky, and Paul Klee joining Kandinsky. On December 26, 1924, under increasing pressure from the National Socialist Nazi Party, the Weimar City Council ended its agreement with the Bauhaus, which in turn moved to Dessau, Germany. Wassily continued writing. His article, Abstract Art, was published in 1925, and his interest in the analytical study of individual elements of a picture led to the 1926 publication of Point and Line to Plane as Volume 9 of the Bauhaus Books series. His theoretical essay, and Some Remarks on Synthetic Art, was published by the international periodical I-10 in January 1927. In 1928, both Wassily and his wife Nina were granted German citizenship, and they were once more able to travel abroad. His first solo exhibition took place in Paris in January of 1929. His second took place in March of the following year. Unfortunately, the political situation in Germany began ramping up in earnest, and the Nazi Party, having the biggest presence in the Dessau Community Council, closed the Bauhaus on October 1, 1932. The Bauhaus then moved to Berlin. After Hitler gained power in 1933, the Bauhaus was raided and closed on April 11th. Wassily and Nina left Germany on December 16th for Paris, arriving on December 21st. In the 1937 Nazi purge of degenerate art, 57 of Wassyly's works would be confiscated. Wassily continued to paint, exhibit, and write while living in Paris. In 1937, the last major retrospective of his work during his lifetime was on view from February 21st to March 29th at the Kunsthalle Bern in Switzerland, and he exhibited at the Paris World's Fair as an abstract artist, though he himself began referring to it as concrete. After his and his wife's German passports expired in August of 1938, Wassily would have had to prove Aryan ancestry to obtain new documents. Wassily decided not to reapply. The pair were granted French citizenship in July of 1939. His last large-scale painting, Composition 10, was completed earlier that year. This, along with the gouache, were the only works purchased in his lifetime by the French government. After the outbreak of World War II and the invasion of France on May 10, 1940, the Kandinskys chose to remain in Paris, although they were offered the chance to escape in 1941. He continued painting small works throughout the occupation, and several exhibitions of his work were put on, including one in New York City. In the spring of 1944, Kandinsky became ill. The Allies liberated Paris on August 24th, and his last small solo show was put on view from November 7th to December 15th. On December 13th, Wassily Kandinsky died of a stroke at age 78. Wassily Kandinsky was the first artist on Rachel Paints Poorly that I came across while actually researching a different artist, Picasso, in case you were curious, and yes, I am going to link that video in the description below. And as I hadn't heard of him before deciding to paint one of his pieces, I decided that if you're going to do Kandinsky, you might as well go full abstraction. And so, without further ado, let's get started, shall we? Secondly, and this is closely bound up with my inner development, I did not want to banish objects completely. I have, in many places, spoken at length about the fact that objects, in themselves, have a particular spiritual sound, which can, and does, serve as the material for all realms of art. And I was still too strongly bound up with the wish to seek purely pictorial forms having this spiritual sound. Thus, I dissolved objects to a greater or lesser extent within the same picture, so that they might not all be recognized at once, and so that these emotional overtones might thus be experienced gradually by the spectator, one after another. Here and there, purely abstract forms entered of their own accord, which therefore had to produce a purely pictorial effect without the above-mentioned coloration. In other words, I myself was not yet sufficiently mature to experience purely abstract form without bridging the gap by means of objects. If I had possessed this ability, I would already have created absolute pictures at that time. Wassily Kandinsky. Abstract art, unlike most Western art before it, declined to represent reality, choosing instead to examine the exchange between colors and forms. Although not religious in and of itself, many abstract artists believed that with their art, they were able to transcend the human experience, while others emphasized the ability of the viewer to achieve a personal connection with the piece. They also emphasized the timeless quality of abstract art, with its absence of cultural references or obvious subject material. Abstractionism pulled from previous art movements, such as Impressionism, Expressionism, and Post-Impressionism, and the Fauves. Vassily himself was impressed by the bold use of color as language in Fauvism, having come into contact with the work of Henri Matisse. On his infatuation with color, his wife Nina said, quote, "Kandinsky was always intoxicated by the fluctuating play of colors. There were fantastic, indescribably beautiful colors in the sky and particularly in the water," he would enthuse. "It was hardly ever calm for a moment, and often you saw at the same moment pure white, emerald green, and deep violet on the sea. Then there was the dry sand in delicate yellow, and the wet sand in various shades of brown, pink, and green. And the sky too, where various colored clouds were chased by the wind across delicate blue. And then in the next minute, the whole picture would completely change," end quote. She also noted that he, quote, "always mixed his own palette from various shades. The colors are different from picture to picture and sometimes even in the same picture," end quote. In addition to color, Vassily made heavy use of points, lines, and planes, dedicating an entire book, Point and Line to Plane, to their study. He thought that the beginning of every work of art began with the point, located in the center of the surface of the canvas, or the plane. The plane, being the origin of the point and everything else developing on it, is therefore close to being invisible and is the void. Vassily wrote, quote, "Canvas is a void, the world before the creation, before chaos. The first sign of life is a point, the moment of the first contact with the charcoal, pencil, or brush. The point is the germ of corporeality, the embryo of creation. Boundless possibilities are latent in it. Potentially, the first future line from it can go in any direction. The line is the first definition of the plane, the first development of the cosmos or the embryo," end quote. Throughout Point and Line to Plane, his dry analytical approach frequently changes to that of philosophical sophistication, opining that the dead materialism should be exchanged for the living spiritual of the immaterial. Of the ideas in the book, Kandinsky commented, quote, "I have made an attempt in this direction in my book, Point and Line to Plane. The analysis of the external element of form should act as a pointer to its internal element," end quote. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Vassily's artistic process was measured and studied. He took months to search for and think through his next project, which was then executed in an explosion of creative energy. For example, the large Composition 7 was completed within 4 days in late November 1913, after many months and dozens of studies and preparation. Although his works were abstractions, he referred to the objects he created as things, despite them having no real-world counterpart, and often described them as having weight, surface, and movement. In spite of the necessity of doing away with real-life motifs in the creation of abstractions, we as humans continue to look for recognizable figures that we can relate back to the natural world. According to art historian Matthias Haldemann, quote, "Our perception replicates what we see, as an act of interpretation and construction. A process unconsciously gets underway where the brain compares incoming signals with the models of the world it stores, and then seeks the most likely solutions. What we see is always an interpretation, a sketch of the world. Not even abstraction can switch off this unconscious process of deciphering," end quote. In anticipation of this, Kandinsky, quote, "intentionally left various developmental possibilities in all elements. Their indefiniteness makes them a place for queries, for the viewer's imagination, which is supposed to exploit creatively the content-related free play in interpreting the elements as an expression of their vitality," end quote. Kandinsky knew that his works, abstract as they might be, were nonetheless still rooted in the material world. When viewing Kandinsky's art, quote, It is equally the product and origin of thinking in images, of a picture we've never previously seen, crystallizing even as we perceive and imagine it, of the picture evolving from the void on the surface of one's consciousness." End quote. Researching Wassily Kandinsky this past week was quite challenging at times, mainly because he is very much an intellectual, and both his writings and the writings of art historians about him and his writings are very dense and take a while to unpack. Even now, I'm not entirely certain I completely understand everything he was trying to do, though I appreciate the thought behind his work. One of the most striking aspects of his life, to me at least, is that he completely changed the course of his career at the age of 30, a time when most of us, I think, are expected, or at least expect for ourselves, to have things pretty much figured out. And this clearly brilliant man gave up the stability of academic employment and moved himself and his wife from his native Russia to Germany to take up painting of all things, although please note that he did have income and property that was independent from his career. And then he underwent a metamorphosis in his artistic style while forging a new path in the art world. As someone in their 30s who ended up not where I thought I would, I found his story very inspiring, and hopefully you enjoyed learning about Wassily Kandinsky as much as I did. And there you have it, Wassily Kandinsky's Bright Unity. Thank you so much for watching. As always, thumbs up if you enjoyed that video, subscribe if you'd like to see more. If you want to follow me on Instagram, you can do so at Rachel Paints Poorly. Until next time, bye. This, along with a gouache, 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 gouache. Okay, gouache. It's weird.